Some state leaders have mentioned the need for Alabama to put an early voting system into place. But just how likely is this to happen, and is it possible this can be done soon? Our Sydney Stallworth found out what would need to happen to get this done in Alabama.
Early absentee voting and early voting in person are different because in early voting in person without the absentee process, you don't need to do anything except to provide a photo ID. In the early in-person absentee process, you still have to make application to indicate the reason why you are voting absentee and why you are voting early.
Leaders like Senator Doug Jones, who was just voted out on Election Day, say Alabama needs an early in-person voting system. This would allow people to vote at the polls early without a pre-approved application. We asked Secretary Merrill if this could be something that's on the table for future elections.
It's certainly something that will be discussed by the Alabama legislature in the 2021 regular session. And when that occurs, then there'll be empirical data that will be presented to them for their consideration, for them to determine whether or not this is something that needs to be offered to all of our people.
The 2020 general election was a record-breaking one for voter turnout nationwide. Alabama is no exception, and that record is in big part due to a surge in absentee voting. Usually, you need to have a specific reason to vote absentee, but this year, anyone was allowed to request an absentee ballot due to COVID-19.
Prior to this election cycle, the largest number of voters that had ever participated in the absentee process was 89,000. This year, we had 318,000 people vote absentee. So obviously, it wasn't much of an encumbrance on those people.
Secretary Merrill says Alabama has had elections with extremely low participation, and that could be taken into consideration when discussing the possibility of early voting.
2014, that only 11% of our people went to the polls. 11. They don't think about in 2016 that only 12% of our people went to the polls. But if you have early in-person voting, you have it when nobody's voting too.
Putting the Valley first, Sydney Stallworth, WZDX News.